last 100 days of World War I were defeat after defeat for the German forces. By October, they knew it was over. It was just a question of how to deal with the situation. The Germans reached out to Wilson, and Wilson responded that they needed to do certain things based along the 14 points. Finally, by early November, it was clear that something had to be done. Germans called for an armistice, and while their troops were traveling to the meeting in Compiègne, the Kaiser abdicated his throne. Basically, the meeting between the Allies and the Germans was very one-sided. There were a few things that the Germans were able to get changed, but basically the armistice was something that was enforced. Interestingly enough, the Allies, at the moment of victory, began to fight amongst themselves over who would be the one to actually receive the armistice from the Germans. Wilson informed House, his representative, that if the Allies could not agree, the Americans would leave, and, well, then the war would be very different. In the end, the decision was made that Marshal Foch, who had served as Supreme Allied Commander, would be the one to receive the German surrender. And it happened on November the 11th, 1918. Technically, the surrender was signed at something like 6 a.m., but it didn't go into effect until 11 a.m. And in the meantime, over 2,000 troops would be killed, the last being an American from the 79th Division who was accused of having German sympathies. Needless to say, after 4 years of war, at least on the Allied side, people broke out into praise, singing, where folks joined in the streets, celebrating. Needless to say, in Germany and Austria, things were very different. When Wilson arrived before Christmas, he was seen as a savior both by the Allies and both by the former Central Powers. There was a thought that the Americans, who had only been in the war for a short amount of time and had suffered much less casualties, could potentially be an honest broker. But already, even before Wilson arrived, things were troubled. In the weeks before the American election in November of 1918, Wilson had made the war political. And in a quirk that can only be found in the U.S., um, the Democrats lost both in the Senate and the House. Thus, when Wilson arrived, he actually had, well, he was operating under a minority government. And to make matters worse, he didn't include any Republicans in his peace group. Now, there were over 30 individuals who were at the peace conference in Paris, but in reality, everything was dealt with by these four individuals. At the far left, you have Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, who had promised to hang the Kaiser, but very soon began to regret that. Next to him was Orlando. He was the representative for Italy. Orlando knew something like 4 phrases in English. Otherwise, he was lost. And as a result, Italy suffered greatly, or at least from their perception, greatly in the peace process. In the center was Clemenceau. Clemenceau had served as a French reporter during the American Civil War, and as a result, he spoke English. And then, of course, on the far right was Woodrow Wilson, the idealist. Clemenceau wanted Germany divided into 4 parts. Increasingly, Lloyd George said no. But as the terms of the treaty became harsher and harsher, Wilson gave in, under the understanding and thought that if he could preserve his League of Nations, all would be good and all could be solved. The Germans had thought that, much like the Congress of Vienna, they would at least be involved in the peace process. After all, they were representing a new democratic Germany. However, they were isolated and only shown the treaty when it was complete. They were told to sign it or else. Initially, they balked, but eventually they were forced to give in. Their people were starving. Now, in drawing up the new Europe, there were a number of crazy solutions that were put together. Austria-Hungary, of course, fell apart, and even going back to 1914, there had been a recognition that the various parts of the empire deserved to have more representation. But the Allies were convinced that the Czechs and the Slovaks could not operate as independent nations, and so they were forced to be together from 1919 until 1993. Austria and Hungary, of course, became independent nations. Austria became a republic, even though to this day the Austrian royal family controls one-fifth of the country. In the Balkans, Serbia, who had started the whole war, was forced into becoming part of Yugoslavia, a kind of grand conglomeration of various Slavic peoples who hated each other. Romania took over Transylvania, which still angers the Hungarians. And of course, Austria surrendered the Südtirol. Next time you watch the Winter Olympics, pay attention to the Italian ski team. Most of the members have German last names, and they all consider themselves native Austrians. Potentially the craziest thing that was created was the Polish corridor, basically dividing East Prussia from the rest of Poland. It made no sense except the idea that Poland needed to have access to the sea, but all it did was just anger the German people. And therein lay the key. Revolution was taking place in Germany. And even though a successful republic would be established, the seeds were set for what would become World War II. As people like Hitler would point out, the Allies never actually took German soil. The army had surrendered before they got there. Maybe, in fact, the army hadn't been surrendered, but in fact, they'd been betrayed by the politicians. While this was not true, it was something that fed into memory, into ideas, and eventually would lead to World War II.